He thought firing me on a Friday afternoon was clever. 38 floors below his corner office, $84 million was already moving, and only one signature could stop it. Mine. He just didn't know that yet. My name is Emma Caldwell, and on a freezing February afternoon in Manhattan, I was 34 years old, Senior Director of Treasury Operations at Halverson Whitfield Capital, and exactly 1 hour and 42 minutes away from being fired by a man who couldn't read a wire confirmation if his life depended on it. The 38th floor of our building on Park Avenue had that particular kind of silence that money buys. Thick carpet, frosted glass, the soft hum of climate control keeping the air at a precise 68 degrees, because our CEO, Richard Halverson, had once read in a Harvard Business Review article that cooler offices produce sharper decisions. Richard read a lot of articles. He rarely finished them. I'd been at Halverson Whitfield for 7 years. I joined as a senior analyst when the firm managed under $1 billion in client assets. By the time I was 31, I was running the Treasury desk. By 33, I had personally rebuilt the firm's entire wire authorization architecture after a near-miss fraud incident that nearly cost us a Goldman Sachs custody relationship. The board sent me a thank you note on heavy cream cardstock. Richard sent me a bottle of mid-shelf Sancerre with a card that said, "Keep it up, kid." I was 8 years older than his daughter. That Friday, February 7th, I came in at 6:45 a.m., the way I always did. Tribeca was still dark, the cab driver still half asleep, Bryant Park glittering with that thin film of ice that turns the sidewalks into glass. I had a venti Americano from the Blue Bottle on 53rd, 3 pending wire approvals, and a quiet, persistent feeling that something was off. I'd had that feeling for about 11 days. It started when Richard's new chief of staff, a 32-year-old named Brian Mathers, who had been hired the previous October because his father played golf with our largest LP, began asking me very specific questions about wire authorization thresholds. Not big-picture questions. Surgical ones. Who can release a wire over 50 million without secondary approval? Is there a way to push an emergency wire through outside business hours? What's the dual control protocol on accounts ending in 44701? I answered everything the way you answer a child holding a knife. Calmly, vaguely, and I made a copy of every email. Because the account ending in 4471 wasn't an operating account. It was an escrow holding $84 million in client subscription funds tied to a closing scheduled for the following Monday. A real estate co-invest with a sovereign wealth partner out of Boston. The kind of money that doesn't belong to the firm. The kind of money that, under no circumstances, is supposed to leave the building until a fully executed closing memorandum, signed by counsel at Sullivan and Cromwell, hits the Treasury inbox. By Wednesday afternoon, I knew something was being built around me, and I wasn't invited. At 2:14 p.m. that Friday, Linda from HR called my desk. "Emma, can you swing by conference room 38C around 4 o'clock? Quick chat." Her voice had the brittle warmth of a hostess at a restaurant that's about to close. Linda had worked at Halverson Whitfield for 19 years. She'd been to my wedding. She did not look me in the eye when I passed her in the hallway 20 minutes later carrying my coffee. That was the first thing. The second was that my badge stopped opening the door to the Treasury wire room at 3:51 p.m. I tried it twice. Then I tried it with the smile of someone who genuinely believes there's been a glitch, because that's the smile you wear when you already know there hasn't been. I walked back to my desk, sat down, and opened a clean Word document. I named it Notes, U207, and I started writing down everything that had happened in the last 48 hours, with timestamps, in the third person, the way our compliance team teaches us to write incident reports. Not because I was angry, because I was a Treasury professional, and Treasury professionals memorialize. At 4:02 p.m., I walked into conference room 38C. Richard was already there in his $8,000 Brioni suit, looking at his Patek instead of at me. Linda sat to his left with a manila folder. To his right was a man I'd never seen before, in a navy suit, and the kind of haircut that costs more than my rent. Outside counsel, probably from one of the white shoe firms on Lexington. The kind of lawyer you bring in when you want the conversation to be very short. Richard didn't ask me to sit. He didn't have to. The chair was already pulled out. "Emma," he said, We've decided to go in a different direction with Treasury leadership. He used the word decided like a man tossing a tip onto a bar, effective immediately. Linda has your separation paperwork. We'll need your laptop, your badge, and your phone before you leave the floor. Security will escort you out. I felt a slow, cold thing slide down the inside of my ribcage. Not panic. Something older than panic. The kind of stillness you feel when an animal decides whether to run or to wait. I asked one question. Just one. Richard, has anyone touched account 4471 today? He blinked. For exactly half a second, the muscles around his eyes tightened. Then the practiced executive smile reassembled itself. Emma, don't make this difficult. Linda slid the folder across the table. The lawyer cleared his throat and said something about the non-disparagement clause. I didn't hear most of it. I was looking at the clock on the wall behind Richard's head. 4:09 p.m. The wire cutoff for same-day domestic processing at Bank of America was 5 p.m. Eastern, 41 minutes. 41 minutes was enough time to push $84 million through if you had the right initiator, the right approver, and the right authorization code on file. 41 minutes was exactly enough time if Brian Mathers had spent 11 days asking the right questions of the right person, and if that right person was no longer behind the wire room door. I signed the paperwork. I didn't read it. I didn't have to. I knew what was in it. I asked Linda for a moment to gather my personal items, and she nodded with that hostess smile, and security walked me back to my desk like I was something that needed to be handled gently before it broke. At 4:47 p.m., I was standing on the sidewalk outside our building with a banker's box, a cashmere coat, and a phone that no longer connected to the corporate network. The wind off the Hudson was sharp enough to cut. The sky above Midtown was that particular shade of bruised slate that February gives Manhattan right before a storm. I should have been crying. I should have been calling my husband. I should have been doing any of the things a woman is supposed to do when her career detonates on a Friday afternoon in front of God and a senior partner from Sullivan and Cromwell. Instead, I stepped to the curb, opened the Uber app, and ordered a black SUV to take me to a small apartment in the West Village, where I rented a desk in a co-working space, exactly 2 blocks from a Bank of America corporate branch. I had a personal laptop in the banker's box. I had a phone with cellular data Richard's IT team had never touched, and I had something else, something I had built quietly over the course of 18 months after the near-miss fraud incident that had earned me the cream-colored thank you card. Richard didn't know it existed. Brian Mathers didn't know it existed. The Compliance Committee had approved it in a single line item on page 47 of the Q3 Protocols memo, and not one of them had read past page 3. It was a personal callback authorization, a safeguard. And on accounts above $50 million, the only name on file at Bank of America Treasury Services for confirming an outbound wire, even one initiated by a CEO, even one approved by a chief of staff, was mine. I checked my watch. 4:52 p.m. In 8 minutes, somewhere on the 38th floor of a building I could no longer enter, Brian Mathers was going to press send on the largest unauthorized wire transfer in the history of Halverson Whitfield Capital. And Bank of America was going to do exactly what my 18 months of quiet protocol building had taught it to do. It was going to call me first. 23:46. Claude responded. The SUV crawled down 7th Avenue through the Friday rush, brake lights pulsing red across the windshield like a slow heartbeat. The SUV crawled down 7th Avenue through the Friday rush, brake lights pulsing red across the windshield like a slow heartbeat. I sat in the back with the banker's box on the seat beside me, my coat draped over my knees, my personal laptop already open on top of the cardboard lid. The driver, a quiet Senegalese man who'd nodded once when I gave him the address, glanced at me in the rearview mirror exactly twice, and then, with the wisdom of a man who has driven 1,000 Manhattan women through 1,000 bad days, decided to mind his own business. 4:58 p.m. 2 minutes. I'd opened a single browser tab. Bank of America Corporate Treasury, Client Portal. Not the firm's portal. Mine. A personal authentication client I'd been issued back in 2024 when Sandra Liu, my counterparty at Buffet Treasury Services, had walked me through the dual-callback protocol over a long lunch at Sant Ambrosius. Emma, she'd said, sliding a laminated card across the table. If anyone ever tries to push a wire over 50 million on one of your flagged accounts, we call the number on this card before the money moves. Doesn't matter who initiated it, doesn't matter how senior. We call you. That's the protocol. That's the protocol you wrote. I had laminated the card myself. It lived in the inner zipper of my wallet, behind my driver's license, where it had sat undisturbed for 19 months. The phone rang at 5:01 p.m. Unknown number, 704 area code. Charlotte, North Carolina. Bank of America's Corporate Treasury Operations Center. I let it ring once. I took a slow breath. I picked up. Emma Caldwell speaking. Emma, hi, this is Marcus Reyes at BOFA Treasury Operations, calling to confirm an outbound wire on account ending 4471, initiated 4:58 p.m. Eastern by user authentication Mathers, Brian, in the amount of 84,000,000 US dollars, beneficiary account at HSBC Private Bank, beneficiary name listed as Caldera Strategic Holdings, LLC. Can you confirm authorization? Caldera Strategic Holdings, LLC. I had never heard that name before in my life. The driver took a left onto 11th, and the SUV slid past a row of brownstones with their windows already glowing orange. Somewhere on the 38th floor of Park Avenue, Richard Halverson was probably still in his corner office, pouring his Friday Macallan, congratulating himself on a clean termination. Somewhere on the 37th, Brian Mathers was probably staring at his screen, watching the wire status indicator, waiting for the green check mark that would tell him $84 million of other people's money had successfully left the building. That check mark was about to depend entirely on the next word out of my mouth. Marcus, I said, I do not authorize that wire. I am declining the callback. Please flag the account, hold all outbound activity, and document this call under the dual-callback protocol on file. I'll be sending a written follow-up within the hour. There was a pause on the line. Not a long one. Marcus Reyes had clearly done this exactly enough times to know that when a flagged account gets declined, you don't ask questions, you execute. Confirmed, Emma, wire is held. Account 471 is now in administrative freeze pending written authorization. I'm logging this call at 5:03 p.m. Eastern. You'll receive an automated confirmation email at the personal address on file within 5 minutes. Anything else? One thing, I said. Can you flag any other outbound attempts on any Halverson Whitfield account above 10 million for the next 72 hours? Same protocol, same callback number. He didn't even pause this time. Already done. I hung up. My hands were not shaking. I noticed this with the detached curiosity of someone watching a thermometer. The SUV pulled up to the co-working space on Bank Street at 5:11 p.m. The Senegalese driver lifted the banker's box from the seat with the gravity of a man transferring something sacred, set it gently on the sidewalk, and gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. Bonne chance, madame. I tipped him 40%. Inside, the co-working space was nearly empty. A few junior associates from a Chelsea startup hunched over laptops, the ambient hum of a Friday night winding down. I had a small private booth in the back, paid for in cash, registered under my maiden name. I sat down, I opened my laptop, and I began to write. Not an email to Richard, not yet. A timeline. A single PDF, exactly 4 pages, single-spaced, no commentary. Each line a timestamp. Each timestamp a fact. EO207, 2:14 p.m. Linda Castellanos, HR Director, called my desk to schedule a 4 p.m. meeting in conference room 38C. No agenda provided. Euro 207, 3:51 p.m. My corporate badge was deactivated at the Treasury wire room door. I documented this attempt with a witness present. Daniel Reyes, IT support. Badge log timestamp on file. 0207, 4:02 p.m. I was terminated in conference room 38C by Richard Halverson, CEO, in the presence of Linda Castellanos and outside counsel. Reason given. Different direction with Treasury leadership. No performance documentation cited. 0207, 4:58 p.m. Brian Mathers, Chief of Staff to the CEO, initiated an outbound wire transfer of $84,000 from account 4471, client escrow, Sovereign Wealth Co-Invest, to a beneficiary account at HSBC Private Bank under the name Caldera Strategic Holdings, LLC. EO207, 5:01 p.m. Bank of America Treasury operations, called the personal callback number on file under the dual callback protocol approved by the Halverson Whitfield Compliance Committee on Oro 6 to 12 of the prior year. Memo reference attached. I declined authorization. Wire was held. I attached the laminated card as an image. I attached the compliance memo. I attached the Bank of America protocol confirmation email, which had just landed in my personal inbox at 5:09 p.m., exactly as Marcus had promised. And then I did something Richard Halverson would have understood if he'd ever bothered to read past page 3 of anything. I encrypted the PDF. I uploaded it to a secure file share. And I sent the link to exactly 3 people. The first was Patricia Yoon, my personal employment attorney at a small boutique on 57th Street, who had drafted my Halverson Whitfield contract 7 years earlier, and who answered her email on Friday nights because she was the kind of woman who hadn't built her practice by being unavailable. The second was Sandra Liu, my contact at Beaufait, who I knew was already aware that something was wrong and would now have written confirmation of exactly what was wrong. The third was an address I had to look up twice before I typed it, because I had hoped for 7 years that I would never have to use it. tipsisec.gov. In the subject line, I wrote, Potential unauthorized transfer of client escrow funds at SEC Registered Investment Advisor, Halverson Whitfield Capital, LLC, CRD 16827. I read it 3 times. Then I clicked send at 5:34 p.m. The radiator in the co-working booth hissed softly. Outside, a wet snow had begun to fall against the window, the kind of snow that turns Bank Street into a Whistler painting. I closed the laptop. I sat back. For the first time since 4:02 p.m., I let myself exhale. My personal phone buzzed at 5:41 p.m., a 212 number I knew by heart, Richard's direct line. I didn't answer. It buzzed again at 5:43, and 5:46 and 5:49. At 5:52, a text from an unknown number, almost certainly Brian Mathers, panicking on a burner, Iboire, appeared on my screen. Emma, there's been a mistake with a wire. Can you call me? Urgent. I read it twice. Then I deleted it without screenshotting, because Patricia had taught me years ago that the cleanest paper trail is the one where you receive everything and respond to nothing. At 6:03 p.m., a new email arrived in my personal inbox. From Patricia, 2 lines. Emma, call me from a landline at 8 a.m. Saturday. Do not respond to anyone from Halverson Whitfield in any medium for any reason until we speak. They are about to make this very much worse. I closed my laptop. I put on my coat. I walked out into the snow and hailed a yellow cab on Hudson Street because some Manhattan moments deserve a yellow cab and not an algorithm. In the back seat, watching the West Village slide past in a wash of orange streetlight and wet snow, I thought about Richard Halverson's face, about the way his eyes had tightened for half a second when I'd asked about account 4471, about the way Linda hadn't looked at me in the hallway, about the 11 days of surgical questions from a 32-year-old whose father played golf with our largest LP. I thought about how, in roughly 36 hours on Monday morning at 9:30 a.m., a sovereign wealth fund out of Boston was going to expect $84 million to land in an escrow account for a closing, and was going to be told instead that the account was under federal administrative freeze pending a regulatory inquiry. And I thought about something else, something I hadn't told Marcus Reyes, something I hadn't put in the PDF. The beneficiary name on the wire, Caldera Strategic Holdings, LLC. I had seen that name before. Once. Buried in a footnote on page 62 of a tax memo I had reviewed 8 months earlier, in connection with a personal real estate transaction Richard had asked me to informally look over as a favor. A Delaware shell. Registered agent in Wilmington. Beneficial owner listed as a trust whose trustee shared a last name with Richard's second wife. I'd said nothing at the time. I'd simply made a copy of the memo the way Treasury professionals memorialize. That copy was sitting in a fireproof safe in a closet in my apartment in Tribeca, 15 blocks from where my cab was now turning onto West Broadway. The snow was falling harder. The meter ticked. I closed my eyes. Richard had thought he was firing a Treasury director. He had no idea what he had actually just done. Comment Caldera if you spotted the shell company before Emma did. The next chapter explains exactly who's behind that name. And it's not who Richard thinks. 1944. Claude responded, Patricia Yoon's office was a small, immaculate suite on the 22nd floor of a pre-war building on 57th Street, tucked between a Steinway showroom. Patricia Yoon's office was a small, immaculate suite on the 22nd floor of a pre-war building on 57th Street, tucked between a Steinway showroom and a tailor whose clientele included 3 sitting federal judges. On Saturday morning at 8 a.m. sharp, Patricia opened the door herself, wearing a black cashmere turtleneck and a single strand of pearls, and gestured me toward the green leather chair across from her desk without saying hello. She set a cup of black coffee in front of me. She set a yellow legal pad in front of herself. She uncapped a Mont Blanc fountain pen with the deliberateness of a surgeon picking up a scalpel. Emma, she said, tell me everything. Start at 6:45 a.m. Friday. Do not skip a single timestamp. I talked for an hour and 14 minutes. Patricia did not interrupt once. She wrote in a tight, slanted script that filled 6 pages of the legal pad. When I finished, she set the pen down, lifted her coffee, and looked at me over the rim of the cup with eyes that had spent 26 years watching men like Richard Halverson underestimate women like me. Emma, she said, they didn't fire you because they were restructuring Treasury. They fired you because they needed you out of the building before 5 p.m. Eastern. The termination was not a personnel decision. It was a logistics step in an attempted wire fraud. I had known this since 5:01 p.m. Friday afternoon. Hearing it said out loud by someone wearing pearls and holding a fountain pen made it real in a different way. 3 things happened this week, Patricia said. She tapped her pen against the legal pad once, twice, 3 times, marking the rhythm of what was coming. First, your termination paperwork. They classified you as a voluntary resignation in exchange for severance. They wanted you contractually silent. We are going to rescind that classification on Monday morning before 9 a.m. Second, the SEC tip you filed Friday night. That has already been routed. You're going to get a call this week from the Enforcement Division. We are going to take that call together on a recorded line from this office. Third, she paused. She set the pen down. She folded her hands. Third, Emma, there is a name on that wire that I need to understand. Caldera Strategic Holdings, LLC. You wrote it down twice in your timeline. You underlined it once. Tell me why. I told her about the tax memo, about the favor Richard had asked me to informally look over 8 months earlier, about the Delaware shell, the Wilmington registered agent, the trustee whose last name was the same as Richard's second wife's maiden name, about the copy in the fireproof safe in my Tribeca apartment. Patricia's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes did. The way a chess player's eyes change 3 moves before the board does. Emma, she said softly, that is not a wire fraud. That is a wire fraud committed against client escrow funds with intent to launder through a related party shell entity controlled by the CEO's family trust. That is a federal case. That is potentially Wells notice territory. That is, depending on what's in the tax memo, possibly a fiduciary breach exposing the entire board to derivative liability. She picked up her phone. Get the memo. Today. I want it in my hands by 2 p.m. We're scanning it, encrypting it, and putting the original in our firm's safe deposit box at J.P. Morgan Chase on 5th Avenue. Then I'm making 3 phone calls. I asked who. She smiled for the first time that morning. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a woman who had been waiting, for years, for exactly this kind of Saturday. Counsel at Sullivan and Cromwell, who represents the sovereign wealth fund that's about to discover its $84 million is frozen. Counsel at the audit committee of Halverson Whitfield, who answers to the board and not to Richard. And a woman I went to law school with at Columbia who is now a senior enforcement attorney at the SEC's New York regional office. She paused, recapping the Mont Blanc. By Tuesday afternoon, Emma, 3 different power centers are going to be looking at Richard Halverson at the same time, from 3 different angles, and none of them are going to be looking at you. I left the office at 9:47 a.m. Outside, 57th Street was scrubbed clean by the overnight snow, the sky a hard, pale blue, the kind of February morning that makes Manhattan look like an architect's rendering of itself. I took a cab to Tribeca. I retrieved the memo. I scanned it at a FedEx on Hudson and uploaded the encrypted file to Patricia's firm portal at 1:34 p.m. The original was in JP Morgan's vault by 4:15. That night, I made myself a single glass of Sancerre, not the mid-shelf one Richard had sent, and stood at the kitchen window of my apartment looking south toward the financial district. The Goldman Sachs building was lit up like a glass altar. Somewhere across the river in Greenwich, Connecticut, Richard Halverson was probably sitting in his 9,000 square foot Fieldstone house, watching the Saturday night news and wondering why none of his frantic Friday phone calls had been returned. He still didn't know about the SEC tip. He didn't know about Patricia. He didn't know about the safe deposit box at JP Morgan. He didn't know that Sullivan and Cromwell was about to receive a courtesy heads up from a counterparty attorney that their Boston client's closing was, as Patricia put it on the phone, experiencing a regulatory interruption. What Richard did know by Saturday evening was that his $84 million wire had not cleared. He knew that because at 9:12 a.m. Saturday morning, Brian Mathers had walked into Richard's library in Greenwich, white as bleached paper, holding his phone, and shown Richard the Beaufait status portal. The wire was flagged. Account 471 was in administrative freeze. No outbound activity permitted pending compliance review. I know this because at 10:48 p.m. Sunday night, my personal email received a message from a Yahoo address I did not recognize. The subject line was Emma, let's talk. The body was 3 sentences. Emma, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'd like to discuss a settlement that compensates you appropriately for the disruption. Please call my personal number at your convenience. RR, not Richard. Not even his full first name. As though signing his initial made the email less of a paper trail. I forwarded the email to Patricia without responding. She replied at 11:04 p.m. with 2 words. Don't blink. On Monday morning at 8:47 a.m., I sat at the small desk in my Tribeca apartment in a charcoal theory pantsuit and a cream silk blouse, hair pulled into a low chignon, and watched the Beaufait Treasury operations portal on my personal laptop. Account 4471 still showed administrative freeze. At 9:03 a.m., a status note appeared beneath it. Account subject to ongoing federal inquiry. All outbound activity suspended until further notice. Beaufait compliance, Ref 020725 NYEDS, EDS, SEC Enforcement Division, Southern District. They had moved faster than I had dared to hope. At 9:14 a.m., my phone rang. Patricia. Emma, we just got a call from a Sarah Mendelson at the SEC New York Regional Office. She wants you on the phone Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern. From my office. Recorded. Voluntary informational interview. No subpoena yet, but she made it clear they have already pulled the wire instruction file from Beaufait and the call log from Marcus Reyes's terminal in Charlotte. They have your dual callback authorization on file. They have the compliance committee memo. They have everything you sent Friday night, and they have already cross-referenced it with 3 filings Halverson Whitfield has made on their 10K over the last 2 years. She paused. I heard her sip her coffee. Emma, they are not investigating you. They are using you as a roadmap. At 9:47 a.m., my personal phone buzzed with a text from an unknown 203 area code. Connecticut, Greenwich, Richard's personal cell. Emma, I'm prepared to offer $2.4 million in separation, full restoration of equity, a board endorsement letter, and an NDA. This needs to be resolved today. Call me. I read it. I screenshotted it. I sent it to Patricia. I did not reply. At 11:30 a.m., Patricia called back. He just upped the offer to $4 million through outside counsel at Wachtell. They're trying to settle before the SEC calls Wednesday. Emma, do you understand what that means? I understood exactly what it meant. It meant Richard Halverson knew by Monday at 11:30 a.m. that the only thing standing between him and a federal wire fraud investigation was a 34-year-old former Treasury director sitting in a Tribeca apartment in a charcoal theory pantsuit who was no longer answering her phone. I closed the laptop. I walked to the window. I looked out at the slow, gray glitter of the Hudson, at the ferries crossing toward Jersey City, at the small, steady, ordinary motion of a Manhattan Monday morning continuing without him. The board meeting at Halverson Whitfield was scheduled for Thursday at 10 a.m. By then, Patricia's 3rd phone call to the audit committee yet would have landed. The SEC interview would be on record. The Sovereign Wealth Fund's counsel at Sullivan and Cromwell would have already informed the audit committee chair in writing that the closing was off and that they were evaluating their position with respect to Halverson Whitfield Capital. And in a fireproof safe in a closet in Tribeca, sitting next to the original tax memo, was one more document. The one I hadn't told Patricia about yet. The one with a signature on page 7 that wasn't supposed to exist. I poured myself a fresh coffee. I sat back down at my desk, and I waited. Wednesday at 1:47 p.m., I walked into Patricia Yoon's office wearing the same charcoal theory pantsuit and the same low chignon I'd worn on Monday. I had learned over the course of 7 years on a Treasury desk that women who win on paper do not need to change costume to make a point. Consistency was its own kind of armor. Patricia met me in the conference room with a glass pitcher of water, 2 yellow legal pads, and a phone in the center of the table that looked, from a distance, like an art object. Polycom, recording enabled. The light on the side blinked a slow, steady red. Sarah Mendelsohn is going to call this line at exactly 2 hours, Patricia said. She is direct, she is fast, and she is one of the best the New York office has. You answer her questions. You do not volunteer. You do not speculate. You do not characterize. Facts and timestamps. Nothing else. I nodded. My pulse was 30 beats slower than it had been on Friday in conference room 38C, and I noticed this with the same detached curiosity I had noticed it then. At 1:59 p.m., I unfolded a manila folder I had brought from Tribeca. Inside was the document I had not yet told Patricia about, the one with the signature on page 7. I slid it across the table. Patricia looked at it. She read page 7. She did not move for 19 seconds. Then she lifted her eyes to mine, and for the first time in the 4 days I had known her professionally, Patricia Yoon, Columbia Law Class of 2002, partner before 40, the woman who had once allegedly made a managing director at Morgan Stanley cry during a deposition, looked very briefly surprised. "Emma," she said quietly, "this changes the conversation." The phone rang at 2:11 p.m. Sarah Mendelsohn introduced herself in the clipped, almost cheerful tone of a federal enforcement attorney who has been doing this long enough to enjoy it. She walked me through the timeline. She asked about the dual-callback protocol, the compliance committee memo, the Beaufet confirmation email. She asked about Brian Mathers, his 11 days of surgical questions, his October hire date, his father's golf relationship with our largest LP. She asked about Linda Castellanos. She asked about the outside counsel in conference room 38C, and when I described his haircut and the navy suit, she made a small sound that suggested she already knew exactly who he was. Then she asked about Caldera Strategic Holdings LLC. I told her about the tax memo, about the Delaware shell, about the trustee whose last name matched Richard's second wife's maiden name, about the original document now in J.P. Morgan's safe deposit box on Fifth Avenue. Sarah Mendelsohn said, "Hold on a moment, please." I heard her cover the phone with her palm. I heard a muffled voice on her end. Patricia's eyes flicked up, met mine, and stayed there. When Sarah came back on the line, her tone had changed. Not warmer, cleaner. The way a surgeon's voice changes when the operation has just gone from complicated to interesting. "Ms. Caldwell, is there any other documentation in your possession, custody, or control that relates to Caldera Strategic Holdings, LLC, or to Mr. Halverson's personal financial interests in entities transacting with Halverson Whitfield Capital?" I looked at Patricia. Patricia gave the smallest nod. "Yes," I said. "There is one additional document. A subordinated services agreement, dated October of last year between Halverson Whitfield Capital LLC and Caldera Strategic Holdings LLC for advisory services valued at $12 million annually. The agreement is signed on page 7 by Richard Halverson in his personal capacity, not as CEO. It was not disclosed to the audit committee. It does not appear in any related party transaction footnote of the firm's 10-K. I have the original in my possession." The line went very quiet for about 4 seconds. Then Sarah Mendelsohn said, in the same clean, almost cheerful tone, "Miss Caldwell, I'd like to send a courier to Ms. Yoon's office tomorrow morning to collect a certified copy of that document. We'll arrange chain of custody." Ms. Yoon, are you available at 9 a.m.? We are, Patricia said. Wonderful, said Sarah. Ms. Caldwell, thank you for your time today. I'll be in touch within 48 hours regarding next steps. In the meantime, I would strongly advise that you continue declining any contact from Halverson Whitfield personnel, board members, or outside counsel. Do not respond to settlement offers. Do not sign anything you receive. Forward to Ms. Yoon, who will forward to me. She paused. Ms. Caldwell, one more thing. You did this exactly right. The line clicked off. Patricia exhaled slowly. She looked at the document on the table. She looked at me. Emma, she said, do you know what you just handed the SEC? I told her I had a guess. You handed them a roadmap to charge a sitting CEO with personal self-dealing, a board with failure of oversight, and a chief of staff with conspiracy to commit wire fraud. You handed them a fiduciary breach so clean it could be taught in a Wharton ethics seminar. And you did it without sending a single hostile email, without making a single phone call to a journalist, without ever once raising your voice. She closed the folder. She set her hands flat on the table. Richard's settlement offer this morning was at $6 million. By tomorrow afternoon, it will be at 15. By Friday morning, it will be at 25 and a board seat. And by then, Emma, none of it will matter. Because by Friday morning, the SEC will have what it needs. I walked out of Patricia's building onto 57th Street at 3:18 p.m. The afternoon had that crystalline February brightness that makes the limestone of the pre-war buildings glow like cut paper. I bought a small black coffee from a halal cart on the corner and walked toward the park. Not because I had anywhere to be, but because I needed to be outside, in moving air, among people who did not know who I was or what I had just done. At 4:04 p.m., walking past the plaza, my personal phone buzzed. A text from a 203 area code. Richard, Emma, 12 million. Equity restoration. Mutual non-disclosure. Settle today, and this all ends. Please. The word please arrived like a small dead bird on the screen. I had never, in 7 years of working for Richard Halverson, heard him say please without irony. The word looked strange on his behalf, the way a man's wedding ring looks strange on a stranger's hand. I screenshotted the text. I sent it to Patricia. I did not reply. That evening, at 6:47 p.m., the first leak appeared. It was small. A 2-paragraph item in the Bloomberg Terminal newsfeed, under the Wall Street Whispers tag. Halverson Whitfield Capital, the Park Avenue alternatives manager with approximately $14 billion in AUM, is understood to be facing a regulatory inquiry into a frozen client escrow account in connection with a sovereign wealth co-investment scheduled to close earlier this week. The firm declined to comment. A spokesman for Bank of America declined to comment. The SEC declined to comment. 3 declined to comments in 2 paragraphs is a Bloomberg writer telling you exactly where the story is going next. By 8:30 p.m., the item had been picked up by a Reuters reporter who added 1 sentence. People familiar with the matter said the inquiry was initiated following a whistleblower tip from a former senior employee of the firm. By 9:15 p.m., the Wall Street Journal had it on its website with a single additional line that landed like a hammer. The whistleblower is believed to have been the firm's former director of Treasury operations, who was terminated on the afternoon of February 7th, minutes before the disputed wire was initiated. My name was not in the article. But every senior person in the alternatives industry on the Eastern Seaboard would know who that sentence described by 10 p.m. At 9:34 p.m., my phone buzzed again. Not Richard, not Patricia. A 619 area code. Boston. I let it go to voicemail. The transcription appeared 30 seconds later. Ms. Caldwell, this is James Whitfield. I'm the founding partner emeritus of Halverson Whitfield Capital and the chairman of the firm's audit committee. I am calling personally to request a confidential conversation at your earliest convenience. I'd like to understand what happened. I am not calling on behalf of Richard. I am calling on behalf of the firm and its clients. My direct line is... I stopped the playback. I sat down on the edge of my bed. I looked at the phone in my hand. James Whitfield. The original Whitfield and Halverson Whitfield. The man who had founded the firm in 1989, who had sold his controlling interest to Richard in 2018, who still sat on the audit committee as chairman emeritus, and, more importantly, still owned 18% of the firm. The man whose name appeared on every door, every business card, every closing memorandum, and who, according to a quiet rumor I had heard exactly once, 3 years earlier, at a holiday party from a slightly drunk compliance officer, had stopped being on speaking terms with Richard sometime in late 2023. I forwarded the voicemail to Patricia. She called me back at 9:51 p.m. Emma, she said, call him from this office tomorrow morning at 10, after the SEC courier picks up the document. James Whitfield is not your enemy. James Whitfield is the man who is about to vote to remove Richard Halverson from the firm that bears his name, and he is calling you to ask for permission. I lay down on top of the covers in my Tribeca bedroom, fully dressed, the charcoal theory pantsuit still uncreased, and looked up at the ceiling. Outside, the snow had started again, soft and slow, the kind that mutes the city into a hush. Richard had thought he was firing a Treasury director on a Friday afternoon. By Thursday morning, he was going to discover that he had instead handed the SEC a roadmap, handed the Sovereign Wealth Fund a lawsuit, handed Bloomberg a story, handed James Whitfield a vote, and handed me, a 34-year-old woman in a charcoal pantsuit, a phone call from the man whose name was on the door. The board meeting was in less than 36 hours. Richard didn't know it yet, but he wasn't going to be the one chairing it. Thursday morning at 9:58 a.m., I sat in Patricia Yoon's conference room with a fresh black coffee, a single sheet of bullet points in front of me, and the Polycom in the center of the table again, blinking its slow red eye. The SEC courier had come and gone at 9:04 a.m., leaving with a certified copy of the Subordinated Services Agreement in a sealed manila envelope and a chain of custody form signed in triplicate. The original was back in the J.P. Morgan vault by 9:42. At 10 Eid Dawar M exactly, the phone rang. James Whitfield did not waste breath on pleasantries. Ms. Caldwell, thank you for taking my call. I will be direct because I believe you appreciate directness. I have spent the last 36 hours reading every email Richard Halverson sent or received between January 27th and February 7th. I have spent the last 12 hours reading every wire authorization document touching account 4471 over the past 18 months. I have spent the last 4 hours on the phone with counsel at Sullivan and Cromwell, with our outside counsel at Cravath, and with a partner at Deloitte who chairs our external audit relationship. He paused. Ms. Caldwell, I owe you an apology. The firm that bears my name allowed something to happen to you on Friday afternoon that should never have been permitted by anyone for any reason. I would like to begin the process of correcting it. May I ask Ms. Yoon to facilitate a conversation about what that correction looks like? I looked at Patricia. Patricia gave the smallest nod. Mr. Whitfield, I said. Ms. Yoon will be in touch. The line clicked off. The board meeting at Halverson Whitfield Capital convened at 10 a.m. that same morning, in a conference room on the 38th floor that I'd walked past 1,000 times in 7 years and entered exactly twice. I was not there. I did not need to be. By 10:47 a.m., Patricia's phone began to vibrate with updates from a partner at Cravath, who was, by some procedural mechanism I did not fully understand, sitting in the room as outside counsel to the audit committee. 10:48 a.m., Richard Halverson removed as CEO by unanimous vote of independent directors, effective immediately. 11:02 a.m., Brian Mathers terminated for cause, escorted from the building, no severance. 11:14 a.m., Linda Castellanos placed on administrative leave pending internal review of her role in the events of February 7th. 11:31 a.m., James Whitfield appointed interim CEO. First action, a written statement to the firm's investors, drafted by Cravath and approved by Sullivan and Cromwell, acknowledging an internal control failure and a regulatory inquiry, and confirming the firm's full and unconditional cooperation with the SEC. 12:08 p.m., Wachtell Lipton withdrew as counsel to Richard Halverson personally. The reasons were not disclosed. The reasons did not need to be. By 1 p.m., the Wall Street Journal had its second story up, and this one had my name in it. Emma Caldwell, the firm's former director of Treasury operations, declined to comment through her attorney, Patricia Yoon of Yoon & Park, LLP. Ms. Caldwell is understood to be cooperating with the SEC's New York regional office. No photograph, no quote. Just my name attached to the word cooperating in a newspaper that is read every morning by every senior person who would ever be in a position to hire me again. Patricia closed her laptop at 1:14 p.m. and looked at me across the conference table. Emma, she said, we are going to settle this with James Whitfield, not with Richard. The firm is going to make you whole, plus a substantial premium in exchange for a mutual non-disparagement agreement that does not, and this is critical, does not interfere with your ongoing cooperation with the SEC. James Whitfield understands this. His counsel understands this. They are not asking you to be silent. They are asking you to walk away with dignity, which is what you were always going to do anyway. The settlement was finalized in 8 days. Patricia would not let me discuss the exact figure publicly, ever, under any circumstances, because that was a condition of the agreement, and because Patricia Yoon kept her promises to opposing counsel as carefully as she kept her promises to her clients. What I can say is this. It was an order of magnitude larger than Richard Halverson's final desperate offer. It included full restoration of every share of unvested equity, valued at the firm's last 409A. It included a written letter of endorsement signed by James Whitfield on Halverson Whitfield letterhead, characterizing my conduct as exemplary, ethical, and in the highest tradition of the fiduciary profession. And it included one clause Patricia had quietly drafted on her own, late on a Sunday night, that I had agreed to without hesitation. A binding commitment from the firm to fund, in my name, a 5-year fellowship at Columbia Law School for Women in Financial Regulatory Compliance. The SEC investigation took 14 months. Richard Halverson was charged with 1 count of securities fraud, 1 count of wire fraud, and 1 count of breach of fiduciary duty in a civil enforcement action brought in the Southern District of New York. He settled the SEC matter for $46.8 million in disgorgement and penalties, a lifetime industry bar, and a 5-year prohibition on serving as an officer or director of any public company. He was not personally indicted on criminal charges, though 3 people I trust at firms I will not name have suggested to me quietly, over various lunches, that the U.S. Attorney's Office considered it and chose to defer. Brian Mathers was indicted on a single count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. He pled guilty in 11 months. He received 18 months at a federal facility in Pennsylvania and a permanent injunction against working in financial services. His father, I understand, no longer plays golf. Linda Castellanos resigned quietly 6 weeks after the board meeting. She sent me a handwritten note on cream cardstock 2 months later that said simply, Emma, I should have looked you in the eye. L. I did not respond. Some apologies do not require a reply. They require silence, which is its own kind of acceptance. The Sovereign Wealth Fund in Boston closed its real estate co-invest in May with a different general partner at terms approximately 4% more favorable to them than the Halverson Whitfield deal would have been. They sent James Whitfield a fruit basket. They sent Patricia Yoon a case of Krug. They sent me, through a confidential channel, a small Tiffany frame containing a single sheet of cream paper on which had been printed, in a careful sans-serif font, the words, "Thank you." The investment committee. I keep it on my desk. I did not return to Halverson Whitfield. I had not expected to. 6 months after the settlement, I accepted a position as head of Treasury and wire operations compliance at a global custodian whose name appears in every retirement account in America. My new office is on the 42nd floor of a glass tower in the financial district, with a view of the Statue of Liberty that on clear evenings is so theatrical, it feels rented. My salary doubled. My equity tripled. The first thing I did in the first week was rewrite the dual-callback protocol for every flagged account over $50 million in the firm's custody. The compliance committee approved it unanimously. They read past page 3. A year after the board meeting, on a humid August afternoon in Midtown, I was walking out of a lunch at the Modern when I saw Richard Halverson across 53rd Street. He was thinner. The Brioni suit had been replaced by a navy blazer that did not quite fit at the shoulders. He was alone. He was carrying a paper bag from a deli, which is the saddest object a former CEO can carry on 53rd Street in August. He saw me. He stopped walking. For perhaps 3 seconds, we looked at each other across 6 lanes of yellow cabs and steam rising from a subway grate. He did not wave. He did not nod. He did not speak. He simply turned, very slowly, and walked east toward Madison, with the paper bag tucked against his ribs. I watched him go. I felt no satisfaction in it, and I felt no pity. I felt instead the clean, settled stillness of a Treasury professional whose books had balanced. The numbers had reconciled themselves. The wire had been declined. The protocol had held. The system had done what I had spent 18 quiet months building it to do, and the system had been enough. I crossed Fifth Avenue, and I turned south, and I walked back to my building in the financial district in the late summer light. In the inner zipper of my wallet, behind my driver's license, the laminated callback card was still there. I had never removed it. I never would. Some women keep love letters. I keep protocols. And on a freezing February afternoon in Manhattan, when the snow was just beginning to fall, and a man in an $8,000 suit decided he could fire me at 4:02 p.m. and move $84 million before I made it to the sidewalk, that single laminated card, and the 18 quiet months I had spent making sure it existed, turned out to be worth more than every word he had ever said to me. I had not raised my voice. I had not sent a hostile email. I had not at any point made a scene. I had simply, on a Friday evening at 5:03 p.m., answered a phone call from a man named Marcus Reyes in Charlotte, North Carolina, and said the word no. That had been enough. That had always been going to be enough.